Every smile felt like an invitation, but every pause kept me guessing. The first time she really noticed me, or maybe the first time I noticed her properly, was during a lazy Saturday afternoon at my friend's house. I had come over casually, expecting the usual, a few hours of games, snacks, and laughter that faded into routine. But when she entered the room, everything felt different. She moved with the kind of confidence that didn't demand attention, yet somehow drew it anyway. There was no dramatic entrance, no sudden gesture meant to announce herself. Just a quiet, graceful presence. She carried herself like someone fully aware of her space and her effect, a subtle magnetism that wasn't flashy, but impossible to ignore. The way she adjusted a cushion on the sofa, the soft click of her heels on the floor, the careful way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, it all made the room feel warmer, more alive. Her smile was easy, casual, yet full of subtle meaning. When our eyes met for the briefest moment, I felt a pull I didn't understand, a strange awareness that she had noticed me, not as my friend's kid, but as someone separate, someone present. It wasn't flirtation, it was curiosity, tempered with warmth, like a gentle question hanging in the air that I wasn't ready to answer. She spoke in a voice that was both confident and comforting, calm but precise, the kind of tone that makes people lean in slightly without realizing it. When she asked how I was doing, the question felt genuine, like she cared more than social etiquette required. And when she laughed at a joke I hadn't even intended to be funny, it wasn't just polite, it was warm, intentional, and somehow lingering. I couldn't stop noticing little things. The soft, deliberate way she moved around the room. How she handled the small domestic tasks, pouring tea, straightening a blanket, arranging magazines, with such care and attention that it made everything seem important. Even the faint, comforting scent she carried seemed to settle into the air around her. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. When she spoke directly to me, she did so in a way that balanced friendliness with a quiet authority. "Don't be shy," she said with a soft, teasing smile, and the words felt like an invitation, not just to talk, but to be seen, to be acknowledged. Something in the way she said it made my chest tighten slightly. It was a warmth I hadn't expected, a tension I couldn't ignore. It was in that moment, surrounded by the ordinary setting of my friend's living room, that I realized something had shifted. I wasn't just aware of her presence. I was aware of the way she made me aware. And in that awareness, there was curiosity, admiration, and something that felt like the quiet beginnings of tension, soft, restrained, entirely unspoken. Leaving that afternoon, the feeling lingered. Not confusion, not desire, not yet, but a heightened sense that this encounter was different from any other. That in the warmth of her smile and the ease of her gestures, something subtle, uncharted, and quietly compelling had begun. By the second visit, the first spark of awareness had grown into something that hummed quietly between us. It wasn't spoken, nothing about it had to be, but it was there in every glance, every gesture, every slight change in her tone. She moved through the house as if it were her own kingdom, confident and graceful, but she noticed me in ways I couldn't ignore. A glance when I reached for the snacks, a tilt of her head as she watched me balance a tray of drinks, a small, teasing smile when I stumbled over a joke I thought had gone unnoticed. I began to notice that she had a way of looking at me that made the space between us feel both intimate and safe, like a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of us was naming aloud. It wasn't overt. She didn't lean in or touch more than necessary. But there were tiny moments that lingered. When she passed a cup of tea across the table, her fingers hovered just above mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. When she adjusted the blanket over the couch, her elbow brushed mine almost by accident, but the contact sent a warmth that I couldn't explain. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of her presence. The way her eyes followed mine while speaking, the subtle shifts in her posture when she talked to others versus when she addressed me, the softness in her laughter that seemed reserved just for me. It was intoxicating in a quiet way, the kind that doesn't make your heart race violently, but makes you suddenly conscious of every inch of the room, every movement, every tiny detail. She, too, seemed aware. Not in a way that demanded acknowledgement, but in a way that invited it if I were brave enough. The pauses in her sentences sometimes lingered, just a beat longer than necessary, as if waiting for me to catch on to something unspoken. And sometimes she did, Her gaze would flick to mine with a playful intensity, just enough to make me question if my imagination was amplifying the moment or if the tension was real. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was admiration for her confidence, for her grace, for the way she carried herself. But that didn't explain the subtle flutter in my chest every time she smiled, or the way I found myself stealing glances when she wasn't looking directly at me. One afternoon, as I offered to help carry a stack of magazines to the living room, her hand brushed the back of mine as she steadied them. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but deliberate in the way it lingered in memory. She looked up at me with a soft, knowing smile, and for a second, time felt like it had paused. The warmth from that tiny brush of skin stayed with me long after I left. There was no confession, no declaration, no rush, just a tension that had begun to define our interactions. It was subtle, restrained, yet unmistakable. Each gesture, each glance, each fleeting touch carried meaning. And as I left the house that evening, the awareness that something unspoken was forming followed me home, quietly, insistently, like the slowest kind of pull one couldn't resist. It was a quiet moment, one that wasn't planned, but somehow felt inevitable. Most of the house had gone silent, my friend was upstairs, headphones in, lost in his own world. I had lingered in the living room under the pretense of grabbing a book from the shelf, and she was there, arranging a few magazines on the coffee table. For the first time, the usual buzz of the house, the laughter, the chatter, the hum of the TV, was gone. The space felt smaller, quieter, and for some reason, it felt like it belonged only to the two of us. She looked up as I approached and offered a soft, disarming smile. "You're always reading something," she said, her tone casual but warm, like she genuinely noticed the habits I often tried to hide. I tried to reply lightly, but the words felt heavier than I expected. There was something in the way she waited, attentive but unassuming, that made it hard to just be casual. We started talking about small things at first, books, movies, the usual safe topics, but slowly, the conversation began to deepen. She asked me about my goals, my thoughts on things I rarely shared, and listened as if she had all the time in the world. Her gaze didn't flick away, it stayed on me, soft but intent. When she nodded at something I said, it wasn't just acknowledgement, it was an understanding that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. At one point, as I shifted a little closer to reach for a book, her hand brushed mine, not on purpose, not in a dramatic way, just lightly, almost naturally. But the effect was undeniable. My chest tightened, and I noticed the subtle warmth of her touch lingering longer than it should have, leaving a quiet echo in the space between us. She seemed to feel it too because her fingers lingered for a fraction longer before she withdrew, accompanied by a soft, almost teasing smile. It wasn't just the touch, it was the ease of the moment. The way her voice softened when she spoke, the calm confidence in her laughter, the way her eyes held mine when she listened. There was no pressure, no suggestion of anything forbidden, but an undeniable closeness had formed in the stillness of the room. We talked longer than I expected, until the air began to cool and the shadows stretched across the room. She leaned slightly forward as she spoke, and her presence filled the space in a way that made it difficult to focus on anything else. Every gesture, the brush of her fingers against the magazines, the tilt of her head when listening, the warmth of her smile, was deliberate yet subtle, like a silent language meant only for me to understand. When I finally got up to leave, she looked at me in a way that made me pause. "You notice things," she said quietly, almost as if confirming what I had suspected about myself. Her words weren't teasing, weren't heavy, they were honest, observant, and somehow intimate. I nodded, aware that what had just passed between us was more than casual attention, it was connection, quiet and unspoken, but undeniable. Walking away, I carried the memory of that moment with me, the soft touch, the warm smile, the gentle attentiveness. It wasn't attraction yet, not in the full sense, but it was something that pulled at me, something that demanded I notice it, remember it, and, in some small, undeniable way, respond. After that quiet conversation, a new awareness settled between us. It wasn't a sudden spark or a dramatic revelation, it was a subtle recognition that everything had shifted. The way she looked at me now carried something more deliberate, measured, as if she were aware of a line that hadn't been crossed but could easily be felt. The room no longer felt neutral, our shared moments began to hum with quiet tension. She was careful. Not distant, but deliberate in her actions. When she handed me a cup of tea or guided me toward a task, her hand lingered just slightly longer than necessary on the counter or brushed against mine by accident, or maybe not entirely by accident. Each gesture was tiny, fleeting, almost innocent, yet it sent a ripple through me. I noticed the deliberate steadiness in her eyes, the soft pauses in her speech, the way she seemed to weigh her words when addressing me directly. I, too, became aware of boundaries that existed between us. There was admiration, curiosity, even a quiet longing that I couldn't yet name, but it was always tempered by caution. She was my friend's mother, an adult with her own life and experiences far beyond mine. The thought of crossing a line, or even being perceived as doing so, made my chest tighten with a mixture of respect and nervous excitement. And yet, she allowed moments to linger. A glance held a second too long, a laugh that felt slightly warmer when I said something unintentionally clever, a tilt of the head that made the conversation feel more private than it should. It was as if she knew the tension between us existed and chose to acknowledge it only in the smallest, almost imperceptible ways. Each pause, each brush of movement, built a quiet language of connection that neither of us fully named. There were evenings when our interactions were charged simply by proximity. Standing side by side to set the table, our shoulders would brush, brief but enough to make me aware of my own pulse. I caught myself watching her hands as she moved, noting the elegance in simple gestures, the care in each motion. It was impossible not to notice, and yet there was never pressure, never suggestion of impropriety, just a restrained, deliberate awareness that drew me in. At times, she spoke with gentle caution, reminding me through tone and demeanor of her place, of the boundaries she maintained. It wasn't a warning, not even a reprimand, it was care, the kind of care that acknowledges attraction without yielding to it. And it worked in reverse. I was conscious of my own restraint, aware that every movement, every word, carried weight. I was learning to move within the space she allowed, responding to subtle cues, respecting the invisible line between curiosity and closeness. The tension, however, did not dissipate. It grew in depth, not urgency, like a slow, steady current beneath calm waters. Each interaction carried the weight of unspoken understanding, that there was something meaningful here, something quietly electric, that required patience, observation, and respect. And in that unspoken agreement, the emotional pull between us deepened, laying the groundwork for what was coming next, a moment when the boundaries would shift, even if just slightly, toward a closeness neither of us could have anticipated. That afternoon began like any other, quiet, ordinary, with nothing remarkable to signal that something was about to change. The house hummed softly with the background noises of a weekend at home, distant laughter from the TV upstairs, the soft clink of utensils in the kitchen. But when we were alone together, even for a few moments, the air between us seemed to shift, thickening with a tension neither of us had yet named. She guided me gently toward helping with a small task, arranging books, clearing the table, or watering plants. Her directions were light, friendly, entirely casual, yet every movement was measured, graceful, and deliberate. As she leaned in to adjust something near me, our arms brushed briefly. The contact was fleeting, but it carried warmth, a spark I couldn't ignore. My chest tightened, not in alarm, but in awareness. Her hand lingered an almost imperceptible moment longer than necessary, as if to reinforce the presence of something unspoken. She smiled then, that soft, confident smile that seemed to hold the weight of experience and the ease of familiarity at the same time. "Don't be shy," she said quietly, her voice lower than usual, lighter, teasing, almost intimate. "I'll take the lead." The words were playful, yet they landed with a gravity I couldn't quite process. The line between casual guidance and personal attention blurred for a fraction of a second. As we worked side by side, she made small adjustments near me, moving a book closer, straightening a cushion, guiding my hand to the right place, all without drawing attention, all natural gestures. And yet, each action carried a deliberate warmth, a subtle intimacy that pulled at me. I noticed the way her hair fell across her shoulder when she leaned forward, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled at something I said, and the soft rhythm of her breath as she focused on the task at hand. I became conscious of my own movements, aware of how close I stood, how my hands mirrored hers, how I held myself in a way that respected the invisible boundary she maintained yet drew me ever closer. Each glance she gave was steady, deliberate, and somehow comforting. Each smile, each small laugh, made the tension thicker without pressing, heavier without being intrusive. At one point, she paused, her hand brushing mine almost accidentally, or perhaps deliberately, while arranging something on the table. Neither of us moved away. Neither spoke. The quiet stretched for a heartbeat longer than it should have, and the room felt suspended. That simple, fleeting touch carried everything that words could not: trust, curiosity, closeness, and an awareness of a connection neither of us fully admitted aloud. By the time the task was done, something fundamental had shifted. The playful comment, the fleeting touches, the lingering glances, they had formed an unspoken understanding. A tension that was no longer simply curiosity or admiration, but a recognition of connection, subtle, deliberate, and electric, yet fully safe, respectful, and YouTube appropriate. Even after I left, the warmth of that moment remained. The touch, the smile, the soft confidence in her voice, it followed me quietly, insisting on being remembered. And I knew that this was just the beginning, that the story between us was far from over. After that afternoon, the quiet tension between us began to take on a new shape. It was no longer just awareness, curiosity, or admiration, it had grown into something deeper, something that felt like understanding without words. Every moment we spent together carried a subtle charge, not urgent or overwhelming, but persistent enough to make each glance, each gesture, meaningful. We found ourselves talking more often, alone for just a few minutes at a time, though always with care and restraint. She shared stories of her life in small, measured ways, lessons learned, choices made, moments that shaped her. Not confessions, not oversharing, just glimpses that revealed depth without ever compromising dignity. I listened, absorbing her words, not just for their content, but for the way she said them, the inflection, the pauses, the warmth behind them. And I shared too. Not everything, but enough that she could see the person I was, not the student or the visitor, but someone quietly searching for guidance, for connection, for understanding. She listened attentively, giving me the space to speak without judgment. Her eyes softened when she smiled, when she nodded, when she leaned slightly closer to hear me better. Each of these small, deliberate gestures built intimacy that went beyond words. Physical contact remained subtle, natural, and entirely safe, yet it carried weight. A hand brushing mine while passing a dish. A gentle adjustment of a sleeve. A moment where our knees nearly touched as we reached for something on the floor. Each gesture lingered just long enough to be felt, to be remembered, without ever crossing a boundary. One evening, as we sat together in the quiet of the living room, she leaned forward slightly, her elbow resting lightly on mine as she handed me a notebook. The warmth of her skin against mine was brief but grounding, and I realized that this kind of proximity, careful, deliberate, respectful, had begun to feel familiar, even comforting. I noticed the rhythm of her breathing, the way her eyes met mine and held the gaze just a little longer than before. She spoke then, softly, with a gentle smile. "You're different," she said, not as judgment, but as observation. "You notice things, in ways most people don't." Her words lingered. I didn't know whether to feel embarrassed, flattered, or simply grateful. There was honesty there, but also a kind of vulnerability, acknowledgement that she had allowed herself to notice me too, in her own quiet way. That recognition, unspoken yet present, made the space between us feel charged with possibility. By the time I left, I carried a strange sense of calm excitement with me. This was no longer just a tension to be felt and wondered about, it was a connection that had been nurtured, quietly and deliberately, through trust, observation, and subtle care. We had begun to understand each other without needing to rush, without needing to cross boundaries prematurely. It was a slow, deliberate dance, one built on respect and mutual recognition. And in that restraint, the bond between us deepened, promising that when the next moment came, when the pause was just right, the story could move forward, fully aware, fully safe, and fully meaningful. The connection we had been cultivating over weeks had grown into something quiet but undeniable. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but in every glance, every gesture, every shared silence, it was clear that something meaningful had formed. We both knew the boundaries, yet we had learned to navigate the space between them with care, trust, and subtle affection. One late afternoon, I found myself lingering after my friend had gone upstairs. She was in the living room, sitting near the window where the sunlight fell in golden streaks, softening the edges of the furniture and her profile. Her presence, calm and deliberate, made the air feel warmer somehow. She looked up, noticing me, and smiled, a gentle, knowing smile, the kind that held both reassurance and invitation without needing words. We talked for a while, as naturally as we could, about books, movies, and small life details. But the conversation quickly shifted to something deeper. She asked about my thoughts, my ambitions, my fears, and I spoke honestly, not holding back. She listened with that same steady warmth, nodding, occasionally laughing softly, and offering insight with a subtle kindness that made each word feel weighted with care. At one point, she reached over to adjust something near me, a cushion, a notebook, and her hand brushed mine just enough to be noticed. This time, neither of us pulled away. Our hands lingered, the contact brief but filled with meaning. There was no rush, no expectation, just presence, trust, and a quiet acknowledgement of what had been growing between us. The tension we had felt in previous weeks had transformed into a calm closeness. When she spoke, her voice carried warmth and humor. When she laughed, it was genuine and soft, directed at me in a way that made the space feel shared, intimate yet entirely safe. I realized then that the unspoken connection, the delicate dance of gestures and glances, had created something far more substantial than either of us had expected. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, leaning slightly closer, shoulders touching ever so slightly, hands occasionally brushing. There was an ease to it now, a mutual comfort that felt natural rather than forced. Each movement, each glance, each gentle touch became part of a rhythm, a slow, deliberate choreography of understanding and trust. When it came time to leave, the goodbye was quiet but full of warmth. She smiled, a soft teasing in her expression, and said, "I'm glad you stayed." I smiled back, feeling a connection that wasn't about words or labels but about recognition, care, and mutual respect. Her hand briefly touched my arm, a lingering, grounding gesture, and I felt a calm certainty that this was real, even without being loudly declared. Walking away, the warmth of that afternoon stayed with me. This wasn't about urgency, desire, or crossing boundaries, it was about patience, understanding, and slowly building a connection that mattered. We had reached a point where trust and closeness existed fully, where restraint had made the bond stronger rather than weaker, and where the small gestures and shared moments carried more meaning than anything rushed or loud ever could. By the end, it wasn't a story about crossing lines, it was a story about choosing to connect, slowly and intentionally, and discovering that sometimes the quietest relationships are the most profound. And in that gentle understanding, the story found its resolution, leaving both of us grounded, fulfilled, and quietly happy.